A poor elderly woman gives her last food to a hungry neighbor and receives more than she gave. The old wooden clock ticked softly on the wall. Each sound stretched across the quiet house, marking the slow rhythm of her days. Margaret Hale lived alone, her world reduced to the same routines, the same rooms, the same worn steps between the kitchen, the chair by the window, and the narrow bed that creaked under her weight at night. Age had thinned her hands, slowed her walk, and made every errand feel like a task meant for someone younger. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a struggle that shaped who you are today? Drop your answer below, and don't forget to hit like if you're ready for this journey. Subscribe to Echoes and Struggles for the next story. Her cupboards rarely held much. A few cans, a loaf of bread, sometimes a sack of rice if she managed to stretch her pension long enough. Food was never plentiful, yet she found ways to make it last. Boiled potatoes, thin soups, bread softened in tea. She carried herself with quiet dignity, never asking for more, never complaining to anyone. Pride held her upright when hunger pressed against her ribs. Winter arrived heavy that year. Winds cut through the village like sharp knives, rattling windows, bending branches, and making the nights feel endless. Fuel cost more than she could spare, so she wrapped herself in layers and placed an extra blanket over her knees. She learned to drink hot water when tea leaves ran out, convincing herself the warmth alone was enough. Her neighbors were not strangers. She had seen them come and go for years, families with children, young couples, men leaving for work before sunrise. From her window she watched lives move briskly, while hers seemed to grow smaller, slower, quieter. One evening, as snow began to fall, she heard a faint knock at her door. It startled her, for visitors had grown rare. She shuffled to the door, her bones stiff from the cold, and opened it to find her neighbor standing there. He was younger but looked worn, with eyes heavy from hardship. He had no coat thick enough for the weather, and his breath rose like mist in the cold night air. Hunger showed on his face, the kind of emptiness that needed no words. Margaret's eyes moved back to her kitchen. On the counter sat a small pot of soup she had stretched from the last of her vegetables. Enough for one meal, perhaps two if she was careful. It was all she had left until her next pension arrived. She felt the weight of choice press into her chest. The thin line between keeping for herself and sharing what little she had. She walked back slowly, ladled the soup into a bowl, and handed it to him with trembling hands. He received it with silent gratitude, shoulders lowering as though the warmth itself lifted a burden from him. She watched him eat, standing in her doorway, the snow falling behind him, the world hushed around them. Pause for a moment. If you were in this situation, what would you do differently? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story speaks to you, tap the like button so more people see it. When the bowl was empty, he left with quiet thanks. Margaret closed the door, returned to her chair, and wrapped the blanket tighter. Hunger crept in quickly, sharp and insistent. Yet a strange warmth settled in her chest, stronger than the fire she could not afford to light. That night, she lay in bed listening to the storm outside, wondering if kindness ever returned to those who gave it when they had little left. She did not expect it. She gave because the need was greater than her own, because she understood what it meant to be empty. Days passed. Her cupboard grew bare. Hunger became a steady companion. Still, she did not regret the choice. She rose each morning, swept her small porch, and watched children run past on their way to school. She folded her hands and waited for her pension, counting the days on the calendar. Then one afternoon, footsteps sounded again at her door. When she opened it, the same neighbor stood there, but this time his arms were full. He carried bags of food, bread, rice, fruit, vegetables, even a roast wrapped carefully in paper. Behind him stood others, neighbors she barely knew, each with something to give. They filled her table with more than she had seen in years. Her hands shook as she touched the bags. Gratitude surged through her, not for the food alone but for the proof that kindness could multiply when least expected. Word had spread of her gesture, how she gave her last meal away. People had not forgotten. They remembered. They acted. Margaret's house transformed that week. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking she had almost forgotten. The rooms, once silent, hummed with voices of visitors bringing more, warm blankets, fresh bread, offers to help with repairs. Children from next door left drawings on her porch. Neighbors stopped to check on her, not out of pity but out of respect. Her life, once small and solitary, widened with connection. Each act of kindness returned to her in waves, far greater than the small bowl of soup she had given. She saw clearly now that her gift had not been about food. It had been about courage to share in the midst of her own struggle. This story shows how strength grows in silence. Tell me, do you believe struggle builds character, or does it break us? Leave your answer below. And while you're here, hit share so others can join this conversation. As spring came, Margaret found new purpose. She joined the church pantry as a volunteer, helping distribute food to families in need. She carried bags, listened to stories, offered smiles, and remembered what it felt like to receive when least expected. Her age did not hold her back. Her heart carried strength she had not known before. She became known in her town not as the woman who lived alone, but as the woman whose kindness sparked change. Her story spread quietly from neighbor to neighbor, then further. People who never met her spoke of her courage, her sacrifice, her quiet victory. Years later, when her health grew frail and her steps unsteady, the same community she had helped carried her. They visited, cooked, cleaned, and sat with her during long evenings. She had no riches to leave behind, no property to pass on, but she left something stronger. She left proof that giving, even in poverty, created abundance that no hunger could erase. Her final days were peaceful. Surrounded not by emptiness but by people who remembered, people whose lives had been touched by her small bowl of soup, her choice to give instead of hold back. And when the church bell rang on the day they gathered to honor her, the pews were full. They spoke of her strength, her kindness, her victory over loneliness and struggle. They spoke of how she showed them all that true wealth was never measured in cupboards or bank accounts, but in the courage to give when giving seemed impossible. Margaret's story became a lesson told to children, a reminder whispered to those who faced hard choices, that even the smallest act of kindness, given at the cost of one's own comfort, can ripple outward and return multiplied. The clock still ticked on her wall, but it no longer measured loneliness. It marked a life that had mattered. A life that had struggled, given, and triumphed. If this story moved you, let's talk in the comments. What part hit you the most? Your voice matters. Support this channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more stories like this reach the people who need them.